recording. Michael?
Are you gonna leave that up and then take it down? Well, now I'm talking. Hello and welcome to the evolution of climate writing in the age of climate collapse. I'm Michael J. Deluca, and here with me are DK McCutchen and Giselle Leeb. Let me start by reading the panel description, and then we'll do bios, and then we'll get on with it. All writing is climate writing, according to Camille T. Dungy's 2018 essay in the Georgia Review, whether it's addressing the 900-ton coal-powered gorilla in the room or deliberately avoiding the unifying crisis of our time. In a 2022 LitHub piece, Heather Hauser argued that climate writing is stuck in a rut because nothing gets done no matter how loudly authors raise the alarm, and writers keep relying on the same tools despite their ineffectuality. Authors Michael Deluca, DK McCutchen, and Giselle Leeb discuss climate writing's weird, experimental future, the new tools it's employing, and how it takes advantage of the realization that everything intersects. I confess I wrote that, and what I wanted to say about those two essays is that when I read them, they made me annoyed and indignant and gave me reactions, which is why I put them in there, because I thought they would have the same effect on the Readercon programming staff, and I guess they did. And they also, I think, had the same effect on Deb and Giselle, who were also irked at some of the subject matter. So my goal wasn't to make us get all into the weeds of refuting everything in those essays, but rather to think of them as a jumping off point. But before we jump off, let's do bios. I'm Michael Deluca. I publish Reckoning, a literary magazine about environmental justice, and these are my two books. Night Roll came out in 2020. The Jaguar Mask is forthcoming in August. They're both about environmental justice and climate. Giselle, do you want to go next?
Sure. I'm Giselle Leeb. I'm a short story writer so far, although I'm writing something longer now. My book is called Mammals, I Think We Are Called, a collection which came out in 22. It was longlisted for the Edgehill Short Story Prize. And it's got a lot of stories about climate change, but it's also got other themes in it, including many stories which sort of have animals featured either directly or indirectly, but it's not primarily about animals.
And I write under DK McCutchen. My speculative fiction trilogies include Jellyfish Dreaming, a Leapfrog Press Global Fiction Prize winner. And also Electric Ice is coming out this summer, and it was winner of a Speculative Literature Foundation grant. I'm currently working on Plastic Eaters. That's in progress. That's going to be the third in the trilogy. And I'm the associate director of the junior writing program at the University of Massachusetts, where I teach writing to College of Natural Science students.
Cool.
Thanks.
Okay, so where should we start? Shall we address Giselle's question in response to Heather Hauser, which is all fiction really climate fiction, and does it matter?
Yes.
Yes, that's a great starting point, yeah.
Do you want to start, Giselle, or?
Oh, I was going to say the same, but I don't mind. Do you want to go first, Deb?
Well, yeah, I guess I wasn't thrilled about her 3 climate writing ticks in her 2022 LitHub piece. I think it was the hopeful ending, what were the other 2?
The litany of depressing stuff.
Yeah, and yeah.
Aside, there was another one.
Aside, yeah, asides.
Right.
Yeah. And I guess the reason I reacted to that was I feel like it's oversimplifying, and my purpose, even though I do use probably all of those ticks, my purpose is to explore ideas, not impose them. I interviewed with Michael in the Mossy Skull once a few years back, and I wrote that I don't think prioritizing moral responsibility in fiction helps the process or how it's received. If there's always an agenda, the only purpose for stories is to preach, and we'd have less of an emotional connection with the stories. So I guess the point being that I think in previous conversations, Giselle has brought up the idea of that character development is very important in fiction. And I feel like we need to just tell stories, you know, without worrying about these tics too much. I think probably my work uses all of those tics, including the litany of despair, but also the hopeful ending, you know, and I've been sort of slotted into YA, probably older YA. And I feel like if you don't give people some hope or some visualization of how to move forward, then why are you writing? Well, actually, no, that sounds like what Heather Hausner's doing. I don't need to dictate how people write, but I know what I did was try to visualize a change of expectation, you know, to try to help people look at how we're living now versus how we will have to live if we hope to survive. But that doesn't necessarily take out the hopeful ending, because I really do feel like the hopeful ending helps us read. It helps us take it on board. It helps us, and I think Michael had a hopeful ending in his Night Roll piece. You know, you had that incredible history of the community, of the sort of environmental justice in the community, and you had the community responding to that. I think, you know, Giselle in Mammals, I Think We Are Called, there was this beauty in the despair that these characters were feeling. Um, and I think that moved me for both of those books.
Uh, the thing that really strikes me about that article is how much despair Heather Hauser seemed to be experiencing at the moment she wrote it. I mean, it really feels like she's stuck in a corner, right? She's identified these things we all do, and it absolutely is. You know, we've talked about this before. Looking at the world, there's not a lot of uplifting stuff out there to make us think that, you know, island nations aren't going to go underwater, and that's the tip of the iceberg of horrible consequences that we are seeing daily here. So I get it, and I have that despair too, and I see the value in sharing that despair with others. I get a lot out of Giselle's writing, which is like there's some cursing into the void vibe, which I love and I laugh about. But getting stuck in that isn't what I want. I want to acknowledge the despair, accept that some of that despair is beautiful and profound, but then take from that acknowledgement some sort of regenerative quality that lets me go on and think of something that isn't despair, I guess.
I think a related point which was quite interesting is because Hauser said it sort of reflects the stuckness of the writing, according to her, climate fiction writing, which I wouldn't necessarily agree with him, reflects the current stuckness of people's attitude towards the environment and what people can do. But I mean, obviously, science fiction historically has actually predicted the future in a sense, in many ways, and created the future sometimes, you know, just by people coming up with different concepts like cyberspace and all sorts of things. Yeah, space exploration, war as well, negative things. But so it's, I mean, I suppose there's two parts to that. The one is it's not necessarily true, I think, but also, I personally, when I'm asked to, there's sort of call outs to sort of say, you know, write a story which has this future kind of a future where things work out well with the climate and so on. I find it quite difficult to think of, you know, to personally to think about what that future would actually look like. But yeah, I mean, it also relates to just what you've both been saying. I mean, in terms of does, like, say, for example, often despair in things actually motivate people to action or not despair in things. So it's kind of, there's wider questions about whether, you know, literature in general and climate fiction literature is actually, it's not, as I think Deb said, you know, once it's not meant to be propaganda, but it's interesting about, in some ways, I'm sure fiction does reflect what's going on. Also, sort of perhaps posits change, perhaps indirectly. I agree with Deb. I don't agree that you should, you know, that you should have tried and write a story deliberately to with a moral purpose to affect people. And I don't think you know what's going to affect people. So I mean, in terms of that, what do you think in terms of you know, that what she said about the future, whether that's true or whether, I mean, in terms of writing, I mean, how do you both find sort of writing in the future? I mean, obviously, I think Deb, your book in particular, sort of, and Michael's actually does sort of suggest things about the future that may happen a bit more than perhaps my writing.
Well, I mean, the thing I liked most about Heather Hausner's article was when at the very end when she said, "While nothing will be solved by writing alone, climate microconventions are barometers of states of mind." And I think that showed more insight than you know, breaking down the climate ticks, if that makes sense. Um, I do think it shows our states of mind, and our states of mind are varied. They're panicked, they're avoidant, they're, you know, there's so many different things going on for people right now. And, you know, when I think about my students and how they're coping with all of this, a lot of them right after the pandemic were hopeless, just hopeless. And it was horrifying. I would see in some ways the avoidance part helps us be less hopeless. So I think it's a necessary human trait. On the other hand, you know, I personally am living in a place that hasn't had a lot of climate events yet, you know, and I see them happening around the world, and it's terrifying. We've had a few. We had Irene, and we had, you know, the flooding and stuff like that, but we haven't had the really big ones, you know, especially the high heat. And I just I'm not surprised that um fiction can't solve everything, but I do hope that we can provide, you know, that varied palette, you know, that people need. Michael, do you want
Yes, I sure do.
to?
So yeah, first, Giselle, I want to contest that you can't predict the future, or that you're not doing it, because uh, it is an absurd and skewed future that you predict in some of your work. But
Yeah, I was just thinking that after I said it, actually, I did a little bit, but
uh,
not.
both my books are like the very near future, so near that it might as well be now. And frankly, that is the only way I am able to write science fiction, is by sort of tricking myself into thinking I'm writing about the moment. Um, there's a like sort of iconic building that appears in Night Roll, the Michigan Central Station, which is this train station that's been abandoned since the 50s, and Ford has bought it, refurbished it, and made it all fancy, and it's got like glowing LED light effects in the front now, and it's all, you know, and I look at it, I'm like, oh, not science fiction anymore. That happened. Anyway, uh yeah, something that you said, Deb, made me want to bring up this quote from another this article in Guernica that we talked about, uh related to preparing for this panel, in which a writer named Ashley Shelby says you can only get through to someone once they've been impacted. This is about, you know, how writing works on people and changes them. And that made me want to bring up a writer who I have recently become aware of. Dana R. Fisher is her name. She wrote a book called Saving Ourselves from Climate Shocks to Climate Action. And her whole point is that until super high heat comes to the Pioneer Valley of Western Mass, people there won't have the motivation to act that the people say in Delhi, India, who are experiencing 126-degree heat right now and dying on the streets feel, you know? And I want to believe that. And I also, the whole experience of writing about climate and caring about climate for most of my life has made me so cynical that it's hard for me to imagine anything that would light a fire under enough people. But that's my own fear. It is not what I put into the fiction.
That's the purpose of fiction, right? Is to help us imagine
Yeah, yeah.
that we haven't lived.
And another quote from this other Guernica article, which we'll share. Here, oh, it's from this guy, Michael Svoboda, another writer, who is talking about how people get in ruts and can't imagine beyond a certain set of outcomes that have already been presented to them. And I think he's talking about people who don't write. He's talking about The Day After Tomorrow, a terrible movie that I never saw because it was obviously not going to have anything accurate in it, right? But I think he's saying, you know, this mass-produced, big budget, blockbuster, explodey movie gave people a vision of the future that they wouldn't have had otherwise. And I feel terrible for those people if that is the only piece of climate fiction that they've encountered, because there's so much else out there that presents all these other possible things to imagine. So when I read that, I was just completely brought to a stop at the idea that people don't have other visions of the future. Except then I look at the regular folks around me who aren't reading indie science fiction, and I think maybe that is how they see the world, and so they really need us, maybe.
I think that idea of changing your concept of the world is very important, because when I first read *Sapiens* by Yuval Noah Harari, I mean, that's what he was talking about quite a lot, about changing your concepts and then changing how you see the world. But then I read *The Dawn of Everything* by David Graeber, I think it was Wingrove, and that absolutely challenged everything *Sapiens* had said. But it was sort of, in a way, like about the circularity of history, and how, you know, for example, there was ancient civilizations before the most ancient civilizations most people know about, and whole cities and different social sort of societies, both autocratic and democratic, a long time ago. I mean, it's the best book I've read for years, but even though it challenged *Sapiens*, it was the same idea about shifting how you see things, and your whole paradigm about the world. And I think that's what's necessary. I mean, the difficulty, I think, with climate change is people will have to change everything. You know, our current society isn't really fit for purpose in terms of many things, as well as climate change, which I think goes back to that article, Camille Dungy. She's sort of saying everything's related, and I don't completely agree. I mean, you could certainly write fiction which isn't about climate change. I think, you know, like a small story about something, but yes, in a way, I think that's what's really needed. So imagination and ideas new stories are kind of at the forefront of what we need, and fiction is obviously does that brilliantly. It engages people emotionally, and that's what's really important, I think.
I can't say his name. Svoboda also said the challenge is figuring out how to tell a new story. And Dungy said the values we place on lives that are not our own are reflected in the stories we tell ourselves. And I think that was another favorite quote of mine from Dungy, at least. Sorry, Michael, you were saying?
What was I going to say? Oh, I was going to bring in, Deb, a question that you put to us was, or to me specifically, was about whether art can change people. And I mean, that's the fundamental question here. Yes, is my answer. But the way I see it doing that is what Giselle was just saying about touching people, compelling people, you know, giving them something to believe in or get an emotional attachment to. It's a long and sort of like I'm thinking of Tolkien's leaf mold metaphor, which is about creativity. But all these inputs go in, and eventually something changes in your life. It's not like one-to-one. The negative example that is always at the top of my brain of didactic writing is the Jonathan Swift piece about eating babies. Are you both familiar with that? It's this very short little article in which he's like, well, are people starving in the streets? Let them eat babies.
Irish babies.
It's a very disturbing, is it 17th century? But he's like the father of the satirical didactic piece of writing, and it isn't meant to convince anyone directly. It's meant to make them laugh and sit back and go, well, isn't that a thing? And I for some reason, as a young writer, I really believed that fiction could directly convince people, and it has taken me 20 years to come around to the slow, beautiful, weird process that actually is hearing a story, internalizing that story, seeing it reflected in the world around you, taking action to, reproduce the patterns you've been shown in the story. And that's, I started Reckoning in 2016, and that was explicitly like, I wanted everyone's writing to be poured into my head so that I would be changed. And lo, it has worked. I have learned things and am different now. So I am a positive case.
I read a
art
book.
changing people.
I read a
Go
book
ahead.
called Zodiac. I'm trying to think. It was by a very famous sci-fi writer, and
Right.
it sent me to study
Is it William
organic.
Gibson?
Yeah, I think it was Gibson, and it sent me to study organochlorines. That was a fiction book. Well, sort of fiction. I don't know. I've heard maybe it wasn't as fictiony as it could have been, but during the pandemic, I feel like creativity and art are and aren't the same things. During the pandemic, I asked my family to, we were all in lockdown, and I asked my family to each find something creative to do. My husband took up playing my father's banjo. My youngest daughter started protesting. My eldest daughter took up weaving. And I wrote. And I feel like without that, art can't change us. The art has to be internalized on some level, I think. Is that fair to say? I don't know. I feel like art is the only thing that can change us, I guess. And some form of creativity. Sorry, Giselle, were you?
Oh no, I was just sorry. I was just thinking when you're talking. I was thinking. I mean, for me, it's if you the last conversation we had, strangely enough, restored my faith in fiction as changing the world because I can't remember why, but you were saying both of you things, and I suddenly thought, yeah, because I think if you take away everything, then I mean, art and I mean, I grew up in a police state of censorship and everything. And if you take it all away, then you realize it's important. I mean, I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's even opposition. If you take opposition away, you often think, going on a march or whatever you're doing is pointless in a sort of specific circumstance. But if you take all that away, it actually makes things worse. So, and I think art and fiction, I mean, I think many people have been changed by books, that's for sure. I mean, just about everyone who's read them is going to have one book, I mean, it's because it's ideas and thinking and life, distilled into fascinating form. So, and I mean, science fiction especially is full of, and fantastical writers, imagination, ideas, it's, yeah, it's going to change you on some level. But I think, as you say, you can't sort of measure it directly. But it's just part. Yeah, I like that idea about the leaf mold. Yeah, a bit like life, really, isn't it? I mean, you can't distill match your personality to specific measurements. I don't think. Well, hopefully not.
So should we try and talk about whether there are new tools for climate fiction? And does it matter? I mean, it sounds like we agree that story is story and story evolves with people, but people are, I'm not speculating as to what you think. I'm back to what I think, but that people remain the same even as things change massively around them. We've talked about that frog in the pot of boiling water metaphor a bit, and I've been thinking about that in a different light since we talked about it, because it made me realize that the reason the boiling water doesn't convince the frog more quickly is that the frog is distracted by something else. And so, we are in this moment in 2024, and what we see is different from what Heather Hauser saw in 2022 or Camille Dungy saw in 2018. Like, the vibe feels different. There wasn't AI in 2018, and everyone apparently was still worrying about the plastic straws thing, which now seems like we can all agree that was a waste of everyone's time, right? So are there new tools, and to what extent are they actually new?
Wow, big question. Sorry, Giselle, do you want to start?
Oh, no, it's fine. No, you go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I feel like so many images came up when you were talking. And I'm blanking on most of them right now. But I think for me, the whole we can't how do we foment change? Let me think about this for a minute, because I feel like I'm gonna mess this up. But I guess I feel like we can't change anything without time. I think time is the essential element for any kind of change, and possibly generational time. I don't know that we have that kind of time anymore. I'm pretty sure we don't. But I also have a lot of I really like the idea that even if we're not here, life is going to continue. We have been responsible for a lot of extinctions, but life is still going to continue. We're not going to wipe out all life, even if we're gone. And I find that incredibly motivating and comforting, I think, to just feel like, yeah, we've had our moment. We took a lot of species with us, but we had our moment. So in terms of tools, I don't think it I feel like what we need to do is be creative, is to create art, is to try to move people if we can, but not preach, not dictate to people how they should interpret our words. And as much as possible, keep people, well, no, that's dictating again. Save me, Giselle. I'm babbling.
Well, I guess picking up from what you're saying. I mean, I completely agree. I mean, I never ever think, now I'm going to sit down and write the story. I mean, I just write whatever comes into my head randomly, and then put it all together and make, and then the story comes out on its own. And I think that's crucial to it being alive in a way, and interest, and also a story, sort of in a, rather than, I mean, it is a story. It's not a lecture. But I think I mentioned that I was so happy the other day. This woman on Twitter just said she thought about my story, The Goldfinch is Fine, every day. Whenever I think of the title, I always want to say The Goldfinch is Dead. It's actually The Goldfinch is Fine. and and she, I thought that's bizarre, and I can't imagine someone thinking of my story every day. But the character, the weatherman, is a really human character with sort of flaws, and he's quite doubtful about himself and his sexuality and everything. So I think a lot of people like that story. And I don't know why. I mean, I don't know where the weatherman even came from. And but at the same time, it's got a love story is within the story about climate change as well. So, it's just it's the story that affects people. And as you say, you can't sort of directly think of the influence, but obviously a lot of people are thinking about climate change. And I also think something you mentioned earlier about Michael, I was just thinking, I mean, people sort of turning the other way, or but maybe both of you, psychologically, we do have a tendency, but repression also leads to kind of obsessive repression of, say, thinking about climate change leads to obsession about it, really. Whatever we repress is really unconsciously affecting us rather badly. So I think people are worried about it and thinking about it actually. But yeah, but I mean, relating it in a human way, I suppose, are the traditional uses the traditional tools of fiction, really, or traditional tools, just the tools of fiction. It's like someone once said to me about documentaries. I want to think of an amazing new way to do them. He said it doesn't matter about how you do them. It's how the how they what the character what the people you're interviewing are like. And both of these writers sort of mentioned the whole gamut of genres. So, but I think climate change is more a subject than a genre as such. So, yeah, I'd agree with Deb. It's just tradition. It's the usual. It's writing, just writing, but a good story. Yeah. So perhaps not a new tool as such. Maybe a new way of telling things.
Yeah, that's interesting. I've been thinking about how we need to rewrite the old stories to make them relevant again. I have a 7-year-old. We've watched all these old Disney movies, the very old ones, which are some of them we skipped. We did not watch Peter Pan, too much racism, but we watched Snow White, which is absolutely chock full wall to wall misogyny. There's nothing in that movie that is not misogyny. Anyway, that is a story that can be retold. You know, these are Grimm's fairy tales, right? They keep being retold, trying to instill them with some value for the next generation, right? So all the old grumpy jerks get mad because they cast a black Ariel the mermaid, but that makes Ariel the mermaid relevant to some new people. And maybe there's a lesson for climate writing there. But I think that lesson is probably that we're all human and this is what we do. So I absolutely do want to read the next piece of climate thinking that's going to come out in 2025 that's going to show me the effects of Trump being convicted on 34 counts of whatever. Just the latest thing, I sure am hoping that the AI bubble will burst and go away. I'm really curious to find out what the effect the AI bubble will have on the science fiction concept of AI. Because I hate that concept now and I don't want to hear about it anymore, but I still love Commander Data, et cetera. So like stories evolve and there's so much, your example of the documentary filmmaking where it depends on who you manage to talk to. Each one of us is so different. And that's another thing that reading The Reckoning Slush teaches me. Submissions. I try not to say slush. The Reckoning submissions. Is that like, I have no idea of the perspective of the person sitting next to me. I don't know what they're feeling about this stuff unless they tell me. And that's what's so great about being a writer and associating with writers is because I can trust them to tell me and to have the skills to tell me in a way that I'll take it in.
We've been telling stories long before we've been writing them. And there was a time I read that if you change the story, you could be killed for it because story imparts culture. It imparts meaningful pieces of our culture. And I think that's what we've got to focus on. We are our cultures. When we tell stories, we are imparting cultural ethics. But that means that articles like The Guardian, where I think it was the 100 biggest companies are responsible for climate change, was the title. That means that they're taking over our culture. Capitalism is taking over our culture. And these things are really damaging our cultural knowledge and understanding. And like Trump, sorry, I shouldn't go there, but it's it's so important to tell the stories that we have because we are these little keepers of culture. But we also might need to acknowledge that they're all going to be gone. When we go, nobody's going to come down from the stars and read our books. That's not going to happen.
Pretty nice. I'm joking. It's
What
not
they, what they
awesome.
might, what they might do is they might see the plastic layer, in the Anthropocene, and they'll read something into that. But, anyway.
So the Readercon folks instructed us to try and go for half an hour so we could leave space for questions. The idea, as I understand it, is that you, the viewer, will be looking at this on YouTube, and then you can go on the Readercon Discord and chat with us. I will make every effort to be there and share the links that we've been talking about. We've gone a bit over half an hour here, but I think we should still have a moment of wrap up. Should we do one of my wrap up questions from the end? You could each tell us about a piece of climate fiction you've been reading recently and how it fits into what we've been talking about here. I've got one if neither of you does.
You start.
Okay, this is just random. This is what I'm reading. Like, I am of the opinion that most things are about climate, even when they're deliberately not, because at least there's the indication that you're avoiding it. So I have here Changes in the Land by Matthew Cheney. Changes in the Land, the reason I bought this book and was all excited for it is the title of I believe it came out in the 90s. It's this anthropological text about New England before colonization. And it's before and through the effects of colonization on how the native peoples stewarded the land and the way that was taken away. Anyway, so I love that book. I've read it a bunch of times. It's fascinating. This is totally not that. This is a Lovecraftian horror book about some evil industrialists who build a nature preserve in New Hampshire where I'm not done with it yet, but I assume Cthulhu is living underneath this nature preserve eating people. Anyway, it provides a really good, I just got to a paragraph in here. It's just one paragraph in this, 100-page novella where Cheney stops and points out that the industrialists are horrible extractive capitalists who have laid waste to everything they touched in order to produce this thing. And I feel like he's taken a moment to editorialize. I don't want to put these words in Matt Cheney's mouth, but he builds this whole story, which is the purpose. It's fun, it's silly, it's creepy. But when I get to that paragraph, I'm like, yes, this is what I've been waiting for. And most people aren't like this, but for me, that may end up being the most valuable part. It may be the part I walk away from this book with. But he did all this work to produce the feeling of horror and then to give me that one paragraph where I can point my horror at and be like, oh yeah.
I just finished reading this remarkable book by it was translated from the Welsh it's sort of like written about the turn of the century, I guess, or no, after the First World War. It's Caradag, you'd say in English, Caradog Pritchard, called One Moonlit Night. And it's sort of like a classic book that's been revived. But again, it's not about climate change, but it's about a small impoverished village where everyone works in the quarries or the mines, and it's through the eyes of this young boy who's also strangely adult. He's about 9 or 10, and full of difficult events, and but it's just about village life, but also community. So these miners who've on strike come and sing, and it's just got these he was a poet as well, a bit poetic moments when they all sing in the song, but a sort of life that doesn't exist now, before obviously any technology. And but yeah, the scenes of the valley and the whole community and the way people interacted and obviously the mines in the quarry, it sort of makes you think about environmental distraction and change and the war. So, but it's incredibly funny as well. It's very dark, incredibly funny, but also very, very hopeful and loving in a strange way, even though it ends on a horrific note. So yeah, I'd really recommend it. It's just an amazing book. Yeah, one of those once in a kind of few years type of book. Yeah.
Cool.
I read an article years ago that I have been trying to find ever since, where an economist said, until we address social justice, we can't address climate change. So to play off Giselle's idea of community, I just want to give a shout out to Michael's Night Roll novella, because that is about community. It's about environmental justice. It's about understanding them. Whether it's solved or not is less clear, but the fact that the community, that this very impoverished community comes together and works together, to me gave me a huge amount of hope, for the future. So again, I believe what the economist said. I think we really have to focus on social justice issues if we're ever going to hope to make any changes in climate.
So
Well,
we've sort
thank
of
you very
come
much for the
back.
compliment.
Yeah, agreeing with Camille, Dungy in a way, haven't we? Because we're sort of both talking about things which aren't ostensibly climate fiction books. Well, yours is, I mean, I think Deb's yours does something similar. I mean, it is about people connecting and even in stark circumstances, and
Very stark.
yeah, but I mean, it is a stark subject, so, it's not, you can't sort of have a happy story. Well, you could have a happy story about climate change in the future, perhaps, but at the moment things are rough. So yeah. Anyway.
Solar Punk has an occasional happy story, but that's a whole nother panel. And as I said to you both before this, I mean, I could have this same conversation again and say completely different things. So for those of you who are watching, I would encourage you to seek out more of this kind of discussion and read more climate writing from people you've never read before. And I hope it inspires you. And I hope this has given you some fun ideas. And thank you very much for listening. And thank you, Deb and Giselle, for participating. And we'll see you on the internet.
Thank you.
Michael, bye, Giselle. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.